So my name's Chip. I have been working in the technology industry since about 1998, and then at least I've gotten paid for it since then. I've been involved in open source since the beginning, except I was a user for many years, up until sometime in the, I think it was about 2011, 2012, started contributing. But this is my first time at a Flink conference, so I want to get a feel for who's in the room. So I'm going to make you move your hands a little bit. How many of you contribute to open source projects? If you could raise your hand. Give me a sense. Okay, maybe about half. All right. And how many of you just use them? Okay, so that should add up to everybody in the room, right? Okay, cool. Well, that helps me. So I want to talk to those of you that create open source projects, and I want to help you understand a little bit more about the context within which those that just simply use it are living their lives today. So the Cloud Foundry Foundation is the home of the Cloud Foundry Platform as a Service project. It's commercialized by companies like IBM, SAP, Pivotal, and VMware, as well as a lot of regional cloud providers, Swisscom, Orange, a few others. And supported by most of the hyperscale cloud providers as well, Ali Cloud, AWS, Microsoft, Azure, and GCP. So I spend a lot of my time, I don't work for any of those companies. I work for the foundation itself, but I spend a lot of my time interacting with the enterprise organizations that are trying to adopt the technology, trying to help understand, some of the change that they're going through inside their company, cultural change they're trying to implement, some of the process changes they're trying to implement around how they develop software. And that's reminded me of the time when I was not helping to produce technology that enterprises used, but instead I was a consumer of it. And things have really changed. So I don't want to talk about technology per se. You're not going to see any charts of systems, and I'm not going to do a live demo. But I actually want to have us all step back for a minute and spend some time thinking about the world, the context that we live in right now. For those of you that help produce open source software, I'm going to have 3 thoughts for you, and I'm going to leave everyone with a request at the end of the talk. So let's talk about history and humans and our evolution and tools and what is technology. And when we talk about technology, it doesn't necessarily mean information technology. It could be healthcare technology. It could be any number of different mechanical technologies. And in fact, we started with mechanical technologies, right? The first technologies that we created as a species were the tools that we needed to feed ourselves, shelter ourselves, and defend ourselves. And over time, humans, and our predecessors, we banded together into groups. And as groups, we realized that it's possible to create more as a group than it was as a series of individuals. And so the tools that we created, the technologies that we created started to evolve. We started to create more impressive structures. We started to learn how to harness the physical world around us in very different ways. Some of the first networks were things like roads. Today we talk about networks and we immediately think about the speed of light and moving information, through fiber optics. But whether it was roads or whether it was the Roman aqueducts, moving water to and from where it was needed, we've always been trying to connect each other. So if you fast forward to today, we live in a really different world than we did 20 years ago. My phone has more computing power in it than entire corporations had available to them 25 years ago. And it's not just the information technology world that's accelerating. We're seeing new technologies be created at a pace that is unparalleled in our history. And in fact, there's reason to argue that we're rapidly approaching the point that as an individual, there's no way that we can keep up with all the technological change that's happening around us, number one. But as a species, even though we kind of compartmentalize, right? There's people that are focused in, let's say, biotechnology. There are people that are focused on genetics. even within those disciplines, it's becoming increasingly difficult to keep up with the pace of change. So you're technologists, right? Who here likes the new cool projects? Yeah, you like to try them? I do. I mean, that's what I do. I'm an engineer. I love to go see what the most interesting new ideas are in my space. But if that's not your day job, if finding the new thing is not your day job, it's very hard. So think about the software developer that works for, let's say, your bank. Anyone here work in the banking industry? Financial services? Okay. Oh my gosh, one of you. Great. So if I say something that's wrong, could you let me know? All right, so most software engineers that I interact with in the banking industry, they have an opportunity to really dig into specific problems, specific business demands. And that opportunity they have to then balance with how do they interact with all the new projects that are coming up out of the open source world, right? It can be very difficult because you have the demands of the business pushing and you have the need to keep up with the state of industry change. So it can almost feel like a tidal wave of change is constantly rolling over you. And it's not just the banking industry, right? It could be, you could be in insurance, you could be in retail, you can be in any industry that uses technology, which is basically every industry today. And it's a tidal wave, it keeps crashing down on you. But you could shift this water metaphor a little bit. In our community, we've been using the metaphor of a kayaker as the ideal state for an individual as well as for a company in navigating this world of constant change that we're in. Kayakers are interesting because whitewater kayakers in particular are constantly having to adapt to the changing conditions in the river that they're in. Because there may be a waterfall, there may be a series of rocks they have to get around. If you just put the paddle down, you're gonna tip over. You're gonna be washed away in that river. And so you have to really stay on top of all the changing conditions as you move. And I think that's apt, right? That's the thing that the enterprise needs to be able to do. Open source started with the idea that we needed software freedom. How many of you remember the software freedom as really being the key purpose of open source? Maybe none of you. A couple of you. Okay. Well, it was a big thing back when open source was young. But today, organizations don't think about open source as being about freedom. It's actually about unlocking opportunity. And it's about finding ways that open source projects can help improve your efficiency or effectiveness at coming up with new capabilities for your own customers. And so when we build open source software, we need to find a way to deal with these two things. There's the promise of opportunity, but there's the reality of the volume of change and new ideas that are coming into our companies or that are just exist in the industry. So there's three perspectives that I have on how open source participants can do not a better job, but how open source participants can think about empathy for the consumer of their technology. In the early days of the open source movement, there was a missive that was written by a gentleman named Eric Raymond. I don't particularly think is a very nice person, and some of his thoughts were good. But he described it as the cathedral and the bazaar, right? And in his analogy, the cathedral was proprietary software. It was the world of software that was commercial, it was closed source, and the bazaar was this wonderful world of open source ideas. But I think we can adjust this metaphor a little bit to kind of fit the reality of the world that the enterprise exists in. How many of you exclusively use open source software? Yeah. I think instead of thinking about this as a either or, we can accept the idea that we need it to be a duality, right? We need to accept the duality of the chaos and the creativity of the open source world, the bazaar, with the proprietary software world. Increasingly, our compute resources are coming from public cloud providers. And those cloud providers don't use all open source software necessarily. Or if they do, it's a black box, right? And that's okay. And we need to think about how we can be comfortable as open source developers building capabilities that tie into commercial systems. Some projects do this very well. Some projects actually push back against it. And I think it harms adoption. It harms the enterprise. This is the Golden Gate Bridge. People familiar with it should know it's in San Francisco, right? Well, that's not the interesting part to me. The interesting thing to me about the Golden Gate Bridge was that before it existed, the city of San Francisco and Marin County, which is just across a, frankly, not particularly far distance, were virtually disconnected from each other. It took hours to drive around the San Francisco Bay, all the way around up to the top, to get into Marin County. And so Marin existed as a separate and isolated community, separate from San Francisco. Now, the benefit of bridges is that you can connect people. So open source projects are very similar. That's actually why I think it's useful for open source communities to collaborate with each other. Because there's oftentimes, there's really two reasons for open source projects to collaborate with each other. You know, the first is obvious, right? There's a synergy, if we want to use corporate speak, between project A and project B, right? They could link up functionally, they can solve bigger problems if they work well together. But I think the second reason is more interesting. We're going to change all the time. The technology that we're using is going to constantly change. And so the more bridges that your community has built with other ecosystems and other communities, the easier it is for your users to navigate to another community, right? It makes it easier for them to say, I'm comfortable with this group of people that produces this software. And they seem comfortable with this other group of folks, right? They work well with them. And so, therefore, I should be able to navigate between open source communities using the bridges that are being built by the contributors. The third thing that I look for out of open source projects is to bake change into their project's DNA. Now, there's a philosophy that every line of code is an asset, right? And sometimes, you know, open source projects love to tout the number of lines of code that exist in their code base. And I think there's some value in that. But I also believe that every line of code is actually a liability. Because every single line of code that your community has to produce, or you write yourself for your business software, it represents the potential for technical debt. It represents the potential for something you have to maintain, because I guarantee you, if you just leave software alone, it's going to stop working. It's kind of fascinating, right? You'd think that something that's deterministic would never break as time goes on, but it happens all the time. So bake change into your project's DNA. Be comfortable with the idea that the code that's been written does not have to exist for your ideas to continue in the future. It's all right for that code to change over time. So those are the three thoughts that I have for those of you that produce open source, and hopefully for those of you that consume it, that makes a little bit of sense, right? There's a lot of change happening in the world, technological change. Maybe nobody in this room feels that pressure, but I think a lot of you might feel some pressure from that. And so think about how we can ease the burden of change over time. I think that there's a lot that the open source contributors can do, communities can do, companies that support open source projects can do, that's going to help make the continued advancement of, you know, information technology easier to navigate over time. And so those are my three thoughts, but I'll just leave you kind of with a final, final thing. If you produce open source software, if you contribute to projects, I just want to leave you with this kind of final thought. As you consider feature proposals, as you consider, you know, a new feature enhancement, a new bug fix that's come in, a pull request, as you consider making a new release of your software, technical validity is absolutely important. But take a second, take 30 seconds, and have some empathy. Put your head in the mindset of an enterprise user that's trying to adopt your technology. See if that changes your perspective. See if it opens up a new insight about how something could be improved, how something could be a little bit easier to consume, and how someone can use your software to continue to evolve their own business. So with that, thank you very much. I appreciate the time.